not too far.
That's
Can
moderate
Smith remake
Republicans.
himself? Does he have time to remake himself in time?
I think he could, but I think the main issue here is that Democrats really have stepped into that place that normally Republicans have filled in Oregon politics. You've got Tom McCall, you've got Mark Hatfield, Bob Packwood, a host of others.
All of whom in another state could be Democrats.
Exactly, exactly. They're moderate Republicans. They switch on specific issues and they have some different views. But it's now moderate Democrats who are filling that void because the Republican Party in Oregon has shifted to the right. But the state hasn't. It's still completely and utterly evenly divided.
Well, I think the answer to your question is yes, Gordon Smith can, depending on who he runs against. He'd have a much easier time pinning Peter DeFazio as the extremist in a race than he might if it was another
the one who really will have trouble
candidate
in the next race for Senate. I think this
should he so run.
I think that if he runs, I think he's the one who really gets hurt by Wyden's victory.
No, wait a minute. We talked initially about the context, and this was a special election. All of the focus of the voters was on this race. Got a lot of visibility, a lot of attention from folks. In 1996, well, November of 96, we're already in 96, but in November, the voters will have umpty-ump initiatives and referenda. They'll have a presidential race. There'll be races for Congress, for dog catcher, etc. And under those circumstances, partisanship is going to play a larger role. Will voters, as the public opinion polls now suggest, react against the excesses of the Republicans in Congress and swing back towards the Democrats? Is the Republican shift really a realignment, in which case the Republican Party and Republican candidates generally are going to do well? My guess is that whoever the parties nominate, though their personalities will be important, there's no question about that, and I think Colin's point that by leaving the moderates behind, the Republicans have damaged themselves, that's absolutely accurate. Nonetheless, there will be a more partisan character for whoever runs in November of 96 for Hatfield's seat.
Well, I think, I would just say, I think it's also worth pointing out that there are a certain amount of coattails here. I mean, you know, it's the economy, stupid. The state of Oregon's economy is quite good. Yes. People may be feeling insecure about the future, but there are more Oregonians employed than in the history of this state. And that had to augur well for the status quo, if you view Wyden as the status quo, as opposed to Smith, who was clearly trying to paint himself as the outsider.
He's a Democrat in a clearly Democratic state. I mean, that's the bottom line, and it just amazes me that people are so surprised that he won. I mean, the surprise is that he won by so little. He's a Democrat in a clearly Democratic state in a nation that is now disgusted for the moment with the Republican leadership.
That's had 2 Republican senators for a long time.
Yeah, could be called Democrats in any other state.
And if we look at Washington and Clackamas counties, so I think we're really the key counties here. They both went for Wyden. Surprisingly, I was convinced that it wouldn't be a huge margin, but I was convinced that they would both go for Smith. And I think that part of the reason was the environment. That's always brought up. But also, there's so much talk in Oregon, especially the Willamette Valley, about growth. And I think those people, they're on the urban growth boundary, they're concerned about growth, and they don't want, they're worried about regulations being taken away. I may be wrong about that.
No, I think it's true even in Marion County, where I would have expected Smith to have done better than he actually did because of the growth issue.
There's one ugly little question that I don't know if any of you will even want to pick up, but a number of people said to me, I couldn't vote for a Mormon. I can't vote for a Mormon.
And
who are
your
friends,
Stephanie?
I didn't hear that.
I didn't say they were my friends.
Oh,
acquaintance people.
And how many people couldn't vote for a Jew? I mean,
right.
I think that's a minority of people.
Discussed very little in this election.
Historically,
I would have expected more.
Anti-Semitism has been a far more powerful force in American politics than anti-Mormon kinds of feelings. So I would guess that if you balance sort of ugliness against ugliness, anti-Semitism, unfortunately, probably wins that race. I mean, that's based on historical statistics, might not be true for this particular race in this particular time, but
I think, there was
didn't get ugly enough for you?
But Kristin, your point that you made earlier is well worth taking, this notion that we're all trying to find the issue that determined this election. And, you know, none of us here, I gather, is a single issue voter in which our decision is made on one issue. And as a general matter, I think Oregon voting population isn't as well. It's a combination of issues. I get back to this, and maybe I'm just really stupid about this female support for Wyden. And I, as a result, talked to a lot of females. And in many cases, it wasn't an issue. A number of them said he just came across as too smug, and that it was a smugness that somehow turned women off in a way it didn't men, and maybe this is a gender show as opposed to a political discussion. But
I think there's a much more easily explained and straightforward explanation for this, and that is if you're a working woman, and I think this is particularly true in the metro area and maybe even more true in the suburbs, if you're a working woman and you hear a candidate say that he wants to recriminalize abortion, it is not just abortion that comment has ramifications for. It reaches to whether you're going or your daughter is going to be able to go to certain higher educational programs. The debate over the Citadel and VMI, although it's far distant, is not historically very far removed. It's about whether or not Title IX of the Civil Rights Act is going to be repealed, as some of the Republicans in Congress have recommended. There are numerous gender issues which are just beneath the surface, and abortion is simply the tip of the iceberg. It is a symbol for a lot of others.
That opens Pandora's box.
But I think there's a lot to do with
now there's a nice analogy for you.
I think there's something about believability here. I mean, I think to a large extent, and I don't know if this is a gender thing or not, but to a large extent, I think Smith came across as a TV candidate, sort of a plastic.
He was too perfect.
Yeah, and Wyden, you know, was at bowling alleys and ice cream socials, and you know, and wears rumpled suits and could not be stopped. You know, his campaign couldn't make him take a day off to watch the Super Bowl.
And it's interesting that Wyden did, you know, for those of us who have seen Wyden when he's not really campaigning, he's not a very photogenic, charismatic person. He says a lot, and
he talks with his mouth full.
He certainly doesn't have a radio voice. I mean, there are all these...
He's very earnest.
But he's very earnest, but he improved on that, from that aspect of it. He improved a lot. In that third debate at one of the TV stations, he looked very good. He looked a lot more polished. Smith was as polished as he usually is.
Let me add one last thing that we haven't talked about, and that's the third-party vote. There were 40,000 votes cast for Karen Schilling from Perot's party, now called the American Party, 15,000 votes cast for Jean Nani of the Libertarians. That's 40,000 votes. If you assume that vote breaks 3-1 for Smith if they're not on the ballot and those voters vote, both of which are considerable assumptions, Smith wins. So the third-party candidates were not trivial in this race.
Yeah, and I think the other primary lesson for this is that when you have a state that's so evenly divided, everything counts in a campaign. It's very high stress. You cannot make any mistakes.
So what happens in the next campaign for Wyden's seat, for Wyden's congressional seat?
I think you'll see DeFazio. I think Jack Roberts will...
Wait, for Wyden's?
Oh, for Wyden's seat. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Earl Blumenauer is clearly the leading candidate. I mean, it's a Democratic seat. I mean, it would take unbelievable calculus for a Republican to win. Right. And I think easily, by virtue of his name recognition and his organizational ability, Earl Blumenauer's got to be considered a leading front runner.
However, if the governor decides to go the short route and bypass a primary, I'm told that the party activists in Multnomah County will pick Shirley Gold. And you're absolutely right, Mark, that the Democratic nomination is the election in the 3rd District.
Shirley Gold is very well connected. She's been around for a long time. Earl Blumenauer is a little bit more exciting, but Shirley Gold would make a very good candidate.
The first time I've ever heard Earl Blumenauer exciting.
Does it boil down to who the governor has a better relationship with? Earl Blumenauer or Shirley Gold?
No, I think that this is based. The governor is very judicious about decisions like this, and he was responsible for making a primary and an election to replace Bob Packwood. And the reason why he did that, he says, is that he wanted to have voters more connected with the seat itself.
I can't imagine him doing anything other than having another primary.
Although, yeah, but there's a problem with the primary because the timing of it would mean that there would be a primary in April, and then you would have the general election during the May primary.
Right.
So that you would have the same candidate running for the general election to immediately replace Ron Wyden, and then you'd have the same candidate running for the primary for November, too.
Kitzhaber yesterday pointed this out, which suggested that he might be more likely to throw this to the parties.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on to the special session. The state legislature is finishing up a brief special session, notable for its lack of fireworks. Governor John Kitzhaber called the session to get funding for a community corrections plan. Although a group of Republicans offered an alternative approach, it didn't get very far. Colin, why not?
Well, John Kitzhaber and Bev Clarno had this locked up weeks ago. They were very disciplined on the corrections bill. Kitzhaber has been working this for months. He has the sheriffs, he has the counties, and those two constituencies are the main reason why the bill just steamrolled into Salem and was just an unstoppable force.
I would agree. This session should erase any doubt in anybody's mind of the political ability of John Kitzhaber.
That's right.
I mean, he has really matured into someone of enormous sophistication in terms of how you cut deals with people who are on the other side of the aisle, and I think this session is evidence of that.
But he's done this for years. When he was the president of the Senate, he used to put people behind closed doors and work out deals that were very surprising. I remember in 1991...
Well, he has, but the Senate... but first of all, this is a much bigger stage.
It is,
and
that's
secondly,
true.
he's dealing with a House, which has always been a far more contentious and argumentative group
But-
than has been the Senate.
I don't disagree with anything you're saying. My point is, though, that Kitzhaber had a track record as he became governor of having put deals together which involved parties from both sides of the aisle and both chambers. In 1991, for example, somehow, and this just blew me away at the end of the session, he came up with a deal between, are you ready for this, Larry Campbell and his most vigorous opponent from Eugene politics, State Senator Grattan Cairns, on field burning. And when I saw Kitzhaber appear at a podium with Grattan Cairns on one side and Larry Campbell on another to announce a deal on field burning, you could have knocked me over with a feather. But he did it. And that's part of his track record historically then.
Well, we're talking about this as if it's a good thing. I'm still not convinced that it's the best thing to call a special session and run this through like this. I mean, regardless of how you feel about the crime bill, there's an argument to be made that a bill of this significance involving this much money that represents a real change in the way the criminal justice system will work in this state should have more
Well, Kristin,
discussion.
the bill had discussion in the regular session.
It didn't have very much.
This was
No,
simply...
It didn't get very
and-
much discussion.
And the sheriffs and the counties had their input, and they felt like they were a part of it. And you talk to them, and they say that this is the best thing that we can ever do. I think that the criticism of John Kitzhaber can't really come and I mean, you can, but he did this masterfully, and he worked it out perfectly. There was no mistakes in how he did it politically. We can talk about criticism of the bill itself, and namely, this has never been done before. This bill is completely new. It's a completely different structure, and there are no statistics that say that this is going to work. There's a pilot project in Yamhill County, but it hasn't been going on for very long, and to compare Yamhill County to Multnomah County is like comparing bananas and oranges.
What's the intent? Is it just to relieve the construction pressure on the state system, and when you peel away all the pretty words? Was that...
Well, basically what it essentially does is it sends prisoners with 12 or less months in prison to the counties, and it's mainly targeted at people who have broken their parole, have a dirty way, have been using drugs, that kind of thing. Right now, the way it happens is they get sent to a state prison for maybe 2 to 4 months, and they get transported from one prison to the other. So what Kitzhaber wants to do is set up a myriad of sanctions that the counties have control over for these prisoners and for other prisoners, that the counties can say, all right, this is what we'll do to you, this is what we'll do to you. It may mean a jail space, it may mean drug rehabilitation, it may mean a dog collar with a radio thing.
It's to free up state prison space
Right,
for
for
all the
violent
other
criminals.
for violent
the more
criminals
serious ones.
because of the stiffer sentencing guidelines.
So are there differential standards among the counties? You get one kind of treatment, one county, something
No,
else in another
well, it's up
county?
to them.
The
It gives them a
treatment
lot
is-
more local control.
It's up to the county.
John Kitzhaber is faced with an enormous burden, which is he's got another 3,000 or 4,000 inmates because of the new sentencing guidelines that were passed with ballot measure 10, 11,
And 17.
and 17, and he's got to build prisons. And he's building prisons, but he says instead of me building all the prisons, basically you and the county are going to have to build some, and we're going to give you some of these inmates, and we're going to give you some money to build the prisons.
And it's
now, how
gonna-
long they stay in that county facility is going to depend on how many inmates there are, because if there's no beds, you kick them out on the
And
street.
what kind of treatment depends
And so one of the arguments that people like Kevin Mannix and Bob Tiernan are making is you're not giving us enough money for to build enough county facilities, A. And B, the other argument is that some of the most dangerous people are, in fact, people who violate parole and probation. This is your recidivist. And these are the last kinds of people that you should be having on a local level.
And the parole and probation officers are apparently opposed to this, but is that because they're going to lose
Well, they'll lose some jobs. I mean, so they'll be moved. Some of those people were working for the state now. I mean, they get paid more. The benefits are better at the state level. And those jobs will be moved to the county level. At least more of those jobs will be. And presumably they could get jobs at a different level, but it's not quite the same thing.
The sheriff of Multnomah County, Dan Noley, who was opposed to Senate Bill 1145 when it was discussed in the last legislative session, and who walked into my office with John Kitzhaber to lobby for it, and I said, "What changed your mind?" And he said, "Money." Kitzhaber agreed to throw more money at Multnomah County to build more facilities, and Noley felt comfortable.
And lest we forget, the Republicans weren't about to let John Kitzhaber get away with drafting a huge crime bill and taking all the credit. They came up with their own crime bill that focuses on property criminals, people who, car thieves, who have 13 to 19 months, and it puts them in jail. And they're calling it, this is wonderful, who could vote against it? It's the tough on crime bill. And so, of course, it's going to pass.
So all those new county spaces are going to go for the guys stealing cars?
No, those will go to state prisons. They'll build some state prison beds for that.
It's worth pointing out that in a period of 2 days, our legislature has agreed to spend upwards of $1 billion. That's
Without
either
very much discussion.
That's right.
And a name that hasn't come up in this discussion that I really think should is Bev Clarno. She has run this. She has dispelled any of the views of her that came from the last session.
I don't know if we have time. I think this is the biggest sleight of hand, because Bev Clarno has done this because she is somehow under the illusion that if she runs a smooth session, she's a legitimate candidate for the United States Senate.
I don't think most voters care.
Yeah, that may or may not be true.
But that was her.
Yes, and she has none of the advantages and all the disadvantages of Gordon Smith.
Mark and I have disagreed all night, but he's absolutely right about this. The reason that she's doing it is so that she can say she ran an efficient special session, and therefore she's a legitimate contender for the U.S. Senate.
Show, and we've got to stop now. Thank you, Bill Lunch, Kristin Gilger, Colin Fogarty, and Mark Zusman for joining us on 7 Days. Good night.